Do you want to cry, but something's holding you back? Maybe it's making you hold in the tears. One of the reasons might be you're afraid that if you start crying, you'll never stop. Or you think tears make you weak. Maybe other people have judged you for that in the past. I'm going to talk about in this video why it's very important to cry. In fact, why it's healing to cry. And it actually can accelerate the healing process from grief to cry. My name is Allison, and this is my Elder Gal journey. I have a master's degree in counseling psychology, and I worked for a number of years as a bereavement counselor. So crying is a very important part of the process of grieving, and it is a very important aspect of healing in that process. Crying basically heals not only your mind, but your body, actually, to a large degree. And it is very important not to hold it in, not to stuff it. I promise you, if you don't cry during your grieving process will take longer. And in some cases, your grieving process will never be resolved. It may not only just be the tears, but it could be other factors as well. So it is very important. Tears do not make you weak. They do not make you weak. Tears make you strong. Tears make you very strong because it allows you to release pain and suffering a little at a time, kind of like the valve. You're releasing a valve. And therefore, it's very important to your healing. So I'm going to share with you a story of my own life when I was a child. When I was 10 years old, my father was killed in a helicopter crash. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Army, and it was of course, it was an accident. It was a sudden death. I was completely traumatized because I was very close to my father, and his funeral was held at Arlington National Cemetery, and I have a very strong memory of that, being at that funeral. But what I remember the most is that my father's mother was Italian. She was from Italy, and she tended to be a very emotional person outwardly. In other words, she would share whatever feeling she was having, whether it was positive or negative, it was pretty much coming out. And my Nana, called her Nana, at the funeral, she was just falling apart. I mean, she just was raw in her grief, and she was wailing and crying, and at one point during the funeral, she actually threw herself on the coffin. And at that point in time, I remember I was standing to the right of my mother. She was holding my hand, and I remember her saying under her breath, "How embarrassing." And in that moment, I knew my mother was wrong. Even then, at the age of 10 years old, I knew my mother was wrong. I knew that what my grandmother was doing was normal. There was nothing wrong with it, and it shouldn't even be thought of as embarrassing. My grandmother, after the funeral, went through about 6 months to a year of very extreme grief. She cried a lot, she wailed a lot, she screamed sometimes, she was in bed for a couple of days at a time, but she came out of it. And she came out of it stronger. And I remember, even though I know she missed my father every single day of the rest of her life, she lived for almost another 2 decades. And she'd been in her late 60s when my father was killed. So that always stuck with me. Somehow, even as a child, I knew that my grandmother had the right way of grieving, in the sense that she just expressed whatever she was feeling in the moment. And that included a lot of tears. Of course, as the years went on, as a teenager, I grew up with my mother, lived with my mother, and my mother was very stoic. And her message to me, not always spoken, but at least unspoken message, was stuff the tears. She didn't want us to be walking around or sitting there crying all the time. So what I learned was to save those tears for nighttime when I went to bed, and I had my own room, and I would probably cry for at least 10 minutes before I fell asleep every night. The problem was I learned to grieve and to cry in hiding. I learned to grieve and cry by myself, not with the comfort of sharing that with other people, which of course sometimes makes it much healthier. So as an adult, years later, I had to contend with the fact that I, first of all, had trouble crying in front of other people, but also I tended to not prolong my crying usually. There was always like a limited amount of time I would let myself cry. And the way that would manifest, and I'm sure some of you can relate to this, is that I would start crying and I'd be sitting down or laying on the bed or something, and within about a minute, somehow I would get up and say, oh, I've got to go into the kitchen for something, or I've got to go to the bathroom, and the minute I would move, I would stop crying. And it's not a mystery why that happens. Movement kills tears. Movement kills tears. So if you're crying, you stay in that position that you're crying in. Because if you don't, the minute you get up and move around, you're going to kill the tears. And that's basically defeating the whole purpose of what's going on. So I've had to fight that within myself. So I know very well how difficult it can be. First of all, I had those early messages from my mother that basically, don't cry in front of anyone else, and, don't be sad all the time. And the second thing was that I learned to fit it into small, places in my life. So I never really gave in to tears for long periods of time. But it is very important to cry as much as you need to. The tears are very healing, and you want to sit with them. If you're sitting in the chair, stay in the chair an extra 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever it takes. Trust me, you will not cry indefinitely. At some point, your body says, it's enough for now. The valve is dry. You basically have run dry in the moment, and you'll wait for the next, round of tears later on. So please sit with the tears. Let the tears come, and trust me, tears make you strong. Tears make you strong, and they keep you strong, and they will allow you to heal. So until next time, be well and stay strong.